This is Dr. Casper, the political scientist, and I'd like to welcome you. Hi there, this is Dr. Casper with the political scientist, here again to bring you a new topic. Today we talk about race and racism. This is a major topic, one that I find that America has a hard time to deal with. If you want to understand what are some of the origins of this topic, we're going to talk about them today. Unfortunately, I do not have the amount of time to go deep in this topic, so I may not give it the full justice, but at least maybe I'll give some thoughts, some other perspectives on the topic of race. Now, to start off with, I want to put context and to my talk, and also I want to put perspective. All right, you're getting my perspective. One, I fit many categories of where you can experience discrimination. I am a man, I'm a black man, I am an immigrant, and I am a minority. So I get to have lived, understood in one way or the other, from my perspective, the place of the immigrant, the place of a minority, the place of a black man, and the place of a man in general Western society. On the other hand, I have another very interesting perspective. For you see, where I come from in Eastern Africa, a place called Kenya, I come from the majority. I'm a member of the majority. I come from, my categorization was not based on my skin color, it was based on my ethnic nation. And so when I look at that, I'm what you call an Agikuyu, who are the majority, who have held majority of the political power, in some ways, sometimes economic power. So I also have the perspective of having the privilege to have lived as a majority who was not a minority, who was not an immigrant, for I can trace my lineage back to hundreds of years. And so I have two very different and distinct experiences in my life. And so I hope that may add certain ideas and values to the topic of race in America. So let's begin. I'm just going to go straight and talk about what factors I think have contributed to why we are unable to deal with the issue of race in America. The first one, and one that if you've watched my videos I always talk about, is the pitting of the issues. Pitting issues together. Clearly, America is not mentally nor emotionally able to talk about race. Right? This is why we want to get rid of the topic altogether, even in the school system, because it's just a very heavy topic. And so we pit issues in order not to talk about issues. I don't know if you've ever had an argument with someone, maybe your spouse, and you want to argue about one thing, and then your spouse brings up something else that you did. That's called pitting of the issues. And so, in this sense, I say I want to talk about black lives and black life issues. The next person on the other side of the room says, why don't we talk about blue lives? I want to talk about the issue of race. Somebody on the other side of the room comes and says, hey, let's talk about critical race theory though. You see how this works. You actually never get to talk about the topic because you're pitting issues against each other. So the first thing that this American society, if it truly wants to deal with the issue of race, we need to stop pitting issues against each other. And I'll explain. I've found that vast majority of Americans who pit issues don't even know how to talk about the issues. So if I were to ask you, in the next 10 seconds, can any of you define what critical race theory is? What are its origins? what is argument. So you can see clearly it's really not about critical race theory. It's not really about the Black Lives Movement or organization. Is that as a nation, as the Western mind, we don't want to deal with the issues. So first you have to acknowledge the fact that we pit issues against each other in order not to talk about the issues. The other thing I want to talk about is the lack of acknowledging that we all grow up in ethnically categorized societies. A lot of us just do not want to acknowledge that. That's why you hear people say, like, I don't see color and all those things. It's because we don't want to acknowledge the reality. See, unless your parent had what I call the ethnic talk, right? If your parents never came and said and talked to you and said, hey, as far as this house is concerned, we will not have discrimination. We will not stand for discrimination. So get yourself together. So if you've never had that discussion with your parents or your uncle, then very much so you have learned how to deal with this issue from a biased society. See, ethnic categorization is part of the American experience. You're white, you're black, you're Asian, you're Hispanic, right? These are categorizations on how we pin ourselves. The problem with categorization is the negative connotations that each category may carry. You see, categorization happens around the world, right? And so if you go to Africa, or sub-Saharan Africa, categorization is not based on skin color, it's based on your ethnic national lineage. Who were your people groups going back thousands of years? That is your distinct. So think about it in the same way you can think of the Irish, the Scottish, the Welsh, the English. That's how it is in Africa. That's your categorization. And the connotations of that categorization may bring upon you discrimination. If you go to East Asia, there are places where they're based on caste system rather, right? So if you belong in one caste, you couldn't talk to another person in another caste. Sometimes you couldn't even touch a person of another caste, right? And they were ranked. Now, here's another thing about categorization. It's one thing to categorize, but everybody is treated equal under the due process of the law and in social context. But the problem of human categorization many times that I've found is people categorize in order to rank the level of importance, the level of power, and the level of interaction. And so when you look at those categorizations, you're told that you belong in this category, you belong in that category. And just to summarize, one of the things that dramatically happened in the Western world and Western world events was it really started in Europe. Is this categorization of Caucasian being the top tier of humanity, a Mongolian was the second tier of humanity, and Negroid was the third tier of humanity. Now you can see Caucasian references the Caucasus Mountains, which would be referencing European descendants or Eurasian descendants. Mongolian is a region in the world, will reference the Mongoloids and the Asian populations. The problem is Negroid is not referencing a place. It's referencing a color. So it doesn't matter where you come from, as long as you possess this color, you are at the bottom tier of humanity. This was such a powerful social construct that it holds true in many societies today, in which people feel if you work yourself up this ladder, if you look closer to the top of the ladder, if you speak or you move closer to the ladder, then your importance will be there. And so there's no need to pretend as if we don't live in a world where things are socially constructed to basically have discrimination, right? So that's one of the things that I find, especially in America, is that we don't even think about it because we're socialized. See, I teach political science. We talk about political socialization. Political socialization is a process in which we learn and we teach our behaviors in politics, in policy. So this is not something that you went to class, you learn, or you joined some secret group and you learn. These are things that you learned in the dinner table. You learned with your uncle, you learned with your guardians, you learned in your communities, in your churches, in your everything. You are ethnically socialized if you live in America. And when you're ethnically socialized and you do not acknowledge or understand that, then you'll be arrogant to the actions and the behaviors that you purport. And if you are unaware, or if you act like you're not ethnically socialized and you've lived in America and you're older than 30 years old, you're either a fool or you actually have accepted to live into that in that world. Right? So you have to acknowledge that we grew up in socialized societies. The third one is xenophobia. Xenophobia. I've heard some right-wing pundits try to say what xenophobia is and what is not. So today we're going to just look at the etymology of xenophobia. Etymology is the study of how words come to be. So let's look at xenophobia. Xenophobia is made up of two root words, xenos and phobia. Xenos from the Greek with the root xen means other, foreigner, stranger, etc. Okay? So that's what that means, that word is xenos. It's a stranger, it's a foreigner, it's another person. It's a person basically outside my known community. All right? Phobia, as most of you know, is an irrational, heightened fear of something. Right? So anytime you hear a word that has the word phobia, is normally referencing the fear of the thing that comes before the word phobia. So xenophobia means the fear of the other category, the fear of the foreigner, the fear of the immigrant, okay? So that is in part within human nature to fear another person or to fear a stranger, okay? However, it is your responsibility to determine how you act in light of that fear. See, the only way to conquer xenophobia is to cure it by removing ignorance. And you apply not by applying knowledge. You cure xenophobia by knowledge. See, the reason why we have racism, the reason why we have discrimination, is because people would rather be more comfortable categorizing people, right, in ethnic groups and talking about them, hey, those immigrants, those Hispanics, those blacks, those whites. It's so much easier to categorize people than to deal with them individually, understand them historically, in order to have a proper assessment of how you approach them. But most of us have this irrational fear inbuilt in us. And again, that rational fear comes from our upbringing, our socialization. So if you're socialized to fear a particular ethnic group, to fear a particular people or categorization, naturally you will behave arrogantly towards those people. Do you see that? And that's how discrimination continues to take part and to grow in societies. And it doesn't matter how rich or progressive your society is. No society is outside the boundaries of ignorance. Because of a lack of knowledge, the people perish. And so we have two things. There's the majority mind and the minority mind. When you think about the majority mind, as I've said, I have lived both worlds. And so one of the things I've learned about when it's in the situation of a majority-minded person is when you're a majority, you just don't understand the complaints of minorities. And unfortunately, you don't actually listen, but you answer. So whenever a minority says something, you're quick to give a quick response on why that minority's argument is just a complaint. Okay, and so there's a problem sometimes because you don't necessarily have to acknowledge their complaints because it doesn't really affect your overall world. And so one of the things about being majority-minded is this, it's natural to be blind to that situation, right? And one of the things to be blind to is it's hard to see what people are talking about when they say you have power and you're privileged, right? So that's one of the things that I learned about being majority-minded is you don't really understand, especially if you are maybe broke or poor and somebody says, hey, you have power and privilege, and you're like, what in the world are you talking about, right? Or, hey, I wasn't there during the days of discrimination. I wasn't there in the days of slavery. So it's very hard when you're a majority-minded person to clearly understand the articulations of minorities when applied to you as an individual. One thing I have to say is when you're a majority, you don't have to apologize for being born in a place of power, privilege. Same thing, you don't really need to apologize if you're born a child of a billionaire. You're just there. But the problem of being majority-minded is if you are, again, do not understand or acknowledge your place and opportunities in society. See, the duty I think that a person in the majority in any society really has, and in America, of course, is if you're born white, is the duty of responding to discrimination. That's about it. That's really the core of it. In other words, what do you do when you realize what somebody around you said was racist or was in discrimination? What do you do when you see a video of somebody undergoing something that you find to be discriminatory? What do you do? How do you respond? See, that's the main thing that most of us can do. Or you can walk away from people who bear such ignorance. See, that's your duty really as a majority, is you have the responsibility to, and that's a duty as a created being, I would argue in the laws of nature, that God has given you the privilege of being a majority. Therefore, you have a level of duty to the minorities. And your duty is to either speak up or remove yourself from others in the majority who you find to want to attest. Because the problem is, birds of a feather flock together. If you hang around people who love discrimination, people who, oh, it's those immigrants, yes, those blacks deserve it, yes, those. If you continue to abide in there, you will soon find that you are part of that problem. So that's what I will say. You have a duty to respond and to listen with empathy. Listening with empathy is very hard. It means shutting up, listening, recording, then taking time to let that marinate. I'm not saying that you have to agree with what somebody is saying, but if you truly want to be an agent of change, then you have to be able to listen, comprehend, understand, ask questions when you don't understand, rather than coming up with conclusions, okay? And so that's the one thing that I will say when you're in the majority, or when you're a majority-minded person, is that you have to see where you may also not have blinders. When you're a minority, I think your biggest challenge is really definitely psychological, right? Because when you're minority-minded, your biggest challenge has always been entrance. You're always trying to enter the society politically, economically. And so you have to create your own history. You have to create your own history and your own identity. Your identity is given by the majority most of the time. It's your choice on whether you want to take that identity or you want to create your own identity and your own history. If you take on the identity that you are given, and if that identity is negative, you will behave soon and your legacy will behave according to that identity. So as a minority person, it's your responsibility to determine what identity you want to walk in, to determine what your history was, in order for you to break through to where you want to be in society, right? And finally, I've been hearing a lot of people say, if you speak up, if you're a minority, you're just a complainer. You need to stop complaining. No, this is the United States of America. People died and fought for the right of assembly, right of speech, right? And the right to petition government. Therefore, if you feel like, hey, there is a level or a form of discrimination, it's your responsibility to speak up and not allow anybody to take from you the most powerful thing, which is your voice. The sixth thing, the other thing that I want to talk about that causes America to have a hard time when dealing with the issue of race is, unfortunately, the group that is supposed to be the moral anchor of the nation, or part of the moral anchor of the nation, and that is the Southern Evangelical Church. The Southern Evangelical Church has been the place that has had the greatest opportunity to end racism and discrimination in America, but unfortunately it has been a place where discrimination has been allowed to flourish. And I call this the Prophet Hananiah versus Prophet Jeremiah issue. The Prophet Hananiah, and some of you may float, but I'll explain. It's in the court of a king called Zedekiah. There are two prophets, and both may have some level of prominence in notoriety, good or for bad. Hananiah is liked, right? He stands for some principles or the law, and he's worked himself up to the king's court, so he's good. But the thing about Hananiah is that we don't know, most people don't know about him, because he spoke only to the point of pleasing and supporting, but he did not speak in rebuke, which is the place of the church. See, when Jeremiah spoke counter Hananiah hit Jeremiah literally in the court, and Jeremiah went through a lot of pain and suffering. And this really gives you the example or the experience of the Southern Evangelical Church. A little bit of history. 1840s and 1850s. Before America really ever fought a civil war, there was actually a spiritual war. The Baptists and the Methodists. The Baptists and the Methodists fought a civil war where the Baptists and the Methodists in the South, recognizing the fact that the majority of the congregation was pro-slavery, were too afraid of what their northern counterparts wanted, which the Northern Baptists and South Methodists said, hey, we cannot be Christians, we cannot claim to that all men are born equal and still allow or support slavery. But you see, if the Southern Methodists and the Baptists in the South agreed with that, they will have essentially sent themselves to the lion's den. And this goes again to what I was talking about. The Southern Evangelical Church wants the place of prominence, wants to keep its members, but they don't want to rebuke the demon of racism because of the consequences. Therefore, when you hear most of the Southern Church talk, they're always spitting issues. They half speak. Hey, let's talk about racism, but let's talk about critical race theory. Let's talk about black lives, but let's talk about blue lives. They do everything to avoid the topic and look for every excuse to go around the topic, because if they touch the topic or if they rebuke, I think this is one of the reasons why they lost political power. Because they are, to be quite honest, they'd rather bow down to the demon, they'd rather bow down to the god of racism than be thrown in the lion's den or be thrown in the fire. And we've seen this, as I said, before the Civil War, there was a church war. Moved to between 1930s and 1960s, they had the ability to end segregation and discrimination. They still, a vast majority still refuse to break away. Again, it's that fear of not rebuking power. And after George Floyd, finally, a small window of opportunity opened up for the church to take over the reins of this issue. As soon as they did that, oh, Black Lives Movement organization is secular. Oh, critical race theory, they're secular. What does that have to do with what is your solution as the church? What is your moral high ground? Because history has shown that you'd rather bow than speak the truth. And so, let me conclude by this topic of racism by saying being racist is the highest level of human depravity. Because when you are racist, you are literally taking the image of God, which is mankind, and claiming that you can own it as property and that you can control it and you can be biased to it. As America, you really have to get to a point that you have to ask yourself, is this worth it? Do I want to continue pitting issues against each other? Do I want to refuse to acknowledge the reality of how society is categorized? Do I want to be xenophobic, or would I rather get knowledge about all people groups? Do I want to not accept the reality that there's a majority mind and a minority mind? And it's my responsibility as an individual to get knowledge, to understand where I come from, to understand the things I learn, and to teach the next generation how to live without this burden that we have carried and this nation has carried for generations. It's all up to us, every individual. And again, if you don't talk about it, you will be socialized by the loud voices in society. And unfortunately, currently, those loud voices are worrisome because they speak a language of discrimination, xenophobia, and the rest. So I can't cover the whole topic to the depth that maybe some of you want, but hopefully those few words have been able to talk to you, teach you, and train you a little bit on the topic of race in America. Until next time, this has been a few moments with Dr. Casper, the political scientist. If you have any questions, comments, leave them below. Until next time, please like, follow, and subscribe. Bye-bye.